I've got a question for each of you to problematize what you said. Let's just go left to right. The advanced technology of the era, the computer, the internet, making lots of jobs obsolete. So think of all of the people in the supermarket who used to have to take inventory, and they're all basically obsolete now because you can just scan it. So the question before us, I think, is partly of offshoring production to cheaper production centers, but also partly about the workers being surplus to requisite for production. Meaning that there's three factors of production, right? There's natural resources, and then there's living workers, and then there's the capital goods, the tools and machinery that previous workers have made. And one of those is now surplus to what is needed, and that's workers. So we have 300 million people in this country. We need all those people to be consumers, so that because sales mean that they're hiring more people and driving the economy, but they just don't. There's too much of us. Our labor is cheap. They can afford all they need of us. So the question of whether the answer to that is actually making cooperatives where everyone can work on parity with their coworkers, or whether we need to actually figure out a way of delivering income to these people that is not coupled to their ability to work. That is to say, if we can deal with the surplus by so we've got this many people who, we've got this many jobs, and we've got this many workers, right? So we can either make more jobs to meet the workers, or we can make it easier to survive without working. And that brings this number down, and then we can get to full employment. So that question to you. Okay, on the question of cooperatives, and maybe this is a question for both of you. So one of the sort of factors that drives capitalism, right, is the owners taking a cut of the value that the workers provide. But another thing, I recently read a book that we spoke about on the podcast called The Origin of Capitalism, which addresses what was happening in England 300 years ago by a scholar named Ellen Meiksons-Wood. And she identifies the main engine that drives capitalism, that reproduces its constant need to expand to new markets and to reinvest profits and develop the forces of production as a dependency on the market, and above all, an imperative to compete with other firms. And I wonder about the question of the need for co-ops to compete with capitalist firms in a capitalist marketplace. Because if we, a co-op, are paying ourselves a fair wage and not polluting our environment, but we also have to compete against that group that's shipping stuff to Shanghai and polluting Detroit or whatever, how to deal with that, the necessity for that competition, which is a necessity that is especially dangerous for co-ops, because if a co-op goes out of business, not only does everybody lose their job, they also lose all their equity. So how to address that? Alexis, I don't actually think that I came up with a question for you. I like all your suggestions. We'll talk tomorrow. We're recording a podcast tomorrow. You should tune in. But feel free to respond to anything I'm saying. And then, Marc, to you, the question of the North Dakota Public Bank. You mentioned that public banks and their ability to invest wisely in communities would mean sustainable energy. And I would just like to note that North Dakota is an oil boom state at the moment, and that just as much as public banking has carried that state through the downturn of the last 5 years, and how you kind of square that circle. Okay, those are my questions. I'll turn it over to them. We'll go from left to right, and then it's your turn. Hit it. Go up here. If you'd like.
I'll talk about 2 points. One about the redundancy of labor, and that we might solve the problem by sharing the unemployment. First of all, many societies already do that. The French have a whole battery of laws and practices, and other countries do it too. And think of it simply. When unemployment hits, for whatever reason, good or bad, that the unemployment is to be shared. Everybody is to be doing 1 hour less work a week, rather than taking some people, depriving them of an entire job while everybody stays. It's the most logical, democratic way to handle that problem, which we don't do in the United States because we have a free enterprise system. That's how capitalism works. The only reason this is done in Europe is that the social movements, the trade unions, the socialist and communist parties made those things happen. Just like it's for that reason that the French have a law that when you start your job, as you graduate from high school or college, you have to get 5 weeks paid vacation. That's the law. I always like to repeat that in American audiences. I like you to think of that. That's why they have a national health service. That's why the tuition at a French university is next to nothing, etc., etc. All the things that are impossible to have in a capitalist system, they already have. Capitalism has always justified every technological breakthrough on the grounds that it would free us from the drudgery of labor. Americans do more hours of paid labor today than at any time in our country's history. All of capitalism's technological breakthroughs have not relieved us of the burden of labor, and that's not because the technology couldn't do it, but because the capitalist system has nothing to do with the rational allocation of work. It has to do with the maximization of profit. And when the maximization of profit conflicts with a rational distribution of work, you all know which one goes. Let me turn next to for me, if you want a rational allocation, which could include a society that decided that rather than have more goods, it would like to have more leisure, and that the work day becomes 6 hours, not 8 hours, and that's a way to handle it, well, fine. This is not a difficult problem. Within capitalism, it's inconceivable. But with a rational understanding of what life is, it wouldn't be. Anyway, on to the next quickly, the competition. Rather than giving you the 800 reasons, which I could do if I had time, how and why a co-op can be more efficient. Well, let me do a couple I can see from your faces. A worker who's part of the ownership and decision-making has a commitment to and a vested interest in an enterprise that a worker who's a mere employee doesn't have. The worker who's a mere employee wants to get home at 5 o'clock. And if it all breaks, and if the machine isn't properly oiled, it's not his concern. But if he's part of what makes that company work and understands that if the machine is intended, it is going to fail everybody, then the probability of being irresponsible is less. It's not zero, but it's less. That's an enormous help. The desire to make progress in an enterprise, if you're part of the beneficiary of it, is obviously different than the incentive to be technologically progressive when the advantage goes to the employer and the shareholder. This does not take rocket science. There's lots of ways that a co-op is and will be more efficient than its capitalist competitor. And now the empirical side. The story of what is arguably the most successful. In 1956, a Catholic priest in the Basque region of Spain, that's below the Pyrenees Mountains, said to his parishioners in a dirt-poor corner of Spain that had suffered from the Spanish Civil War and then the Second World War and all the rest, if we sit around here waiting for some capitalist to come and employ us, we'll never have jobs. So let's make a co-op instead. Father Arizmendi, by name, was the priest, and 6 workers started a co-op. Okay, fast forward to 2013. The Mondragon Cooperative Corporation today employs more than 100,000 workers. It's the 7th largest corporation in all of Spain and the largest corporation in the Basque region. It has spent the last 60-odd years competing with capitalist enterprises and winning that competition. Okay? It now has its own university, Mondragon University, its own bank, Caja Laboral, and it has 4 high research labs that it maintains. 2 American companies are so taken with the research of the Mondragon that they requested and pay for the opportunity for their own scientists to work alongside the scientists employed by this co-op. The corporations are named General Motors and Microsoft. You don't have to worry about the competitiveness of cooperatives.
I'll take the second question related to competitiveness or effectiveness of cooperatives. Certainly there is the question though of you have cooperatives that are cooperatives that have to face competition directly with corporations that have the traditional capitalist structure. And there is a different motive, a different incentive. And certainly cooperatives, when they are working on them by themselves, are at a disadvantage. And we have seen quite a number of times cooperatives that what it's known as demutualize or are no longer cooperatives and move to go from cooperative to traditional business structure or capitalist structure, because at some point they lose an element of what made them a cooperative in the first place. And it's a reality. It's something that actually does happen. But what Rick had mentioned with the example of the Mondragon cooperatives, and that you see also in the Emilia-Romagna region of Italy, that has their own, also an equally extensive and much larger network of cooperatives. What makes them strong is their ability to network and to connect with other cooperatives. Alone, a cooperative it's destined to face stiff competition from businesses that have as a motive, that have as part of their ingrained structures to expand, to reduce costs, to increase profits for a few, that gives them an advantage in the sense that you can have a Starbucks on every street corner. But when it comes to actually creating value for the people in that community, creating value for the workers, then certainly the hand goes to the cooperatives. But we see here in the U.S. there's been an incredible growth in the networking of cooperatives. Here in New York City, I mentioned earlier that when we started 10 years ago, there was one worker cooperative. Today there are at least 20 worker cooperatives in New York City. There's a network now called the New York City Network of Worker Cooperatives. So these are cooperatives, worker co-ops that have formed, that have come together. We have now developer organizations. So Green Worker Cooperatives is a cooperative developer, where we have a number of other cooperative developer sister organizations that we work with. Creating that infrastructure that allows for the growth of cooperatives is a key to the growth of the sector. And it's only when you have a strong sector that we can have cooperatives that continue to thrive, where workers don't feel like they're alone, swimming alone in the capitalist sea with no help whenever they run into problems. And eventually people run into problems. But it's when you have the support of others that you're able to wade through those problems and be able to get to the other side.
There was just one thing that I wrote down that's not apropos of any of your questions, but it just is something that came up when you were talking, Omar, that I thought was really compelling, which is that being in a co-op makes you a better communicator, and it's like mending these relationships that we have like fragmented for so long, because we're not used to having to like work through and arrive at consensus and do that dirty work. And it's not really dirty, it's just hard. And my only comment on that is that, so I'm someone who came out of Wall Street, quit my job, and then 1 year later was involved with Occupy, and that was kind of a lesson that I learned through the General Assembly and trying to come to consensus through the General Assembly. But that point resonated with me because I guess I just learned that lesson through a different way. But there's a real beauty, I think, in inefficiency sometimes, and we fetishize efficiency, and it makes us less whole as people, I think. So that's my only comment.
Squaring the circle with regards to the tremendous increase in oil production in North Dakota. There are a number of different angles I can take this at, but I want to first of all point out the total loan portfolio for North Dakota is about $3.3 billion. The largest segment of that is student loans, and the student loans are on average, the interest rate is 30 to 40% less than in other states. The second largest loan portfolio is home mortgages, and then the third is commercial loans, the fourth is ag loans. So oil is being, there are companies that have taken out loans through the Bank of North Dakota that are involved in fossil fuel development, but that's a decision that the people of North Dakota have made. And because there's this democratic approach to shaping their economy, I think it's really important for us to respect that, even though I personally would disagree with that. In Vermont, they would certainly never particularly since they've banned fracking in the entire state of Vermont, they would not use their public bank to do fossil fuel development. And that's, of course, more aligned with my values. But again, it's going to be up to the people in a respective economy to determine how the public credit is used according to the values that they have. And so that is going to be the reality associated with public banks. Our vision is to have 50 state-owned banks in the United States, as well as scores of county and city-owned banks. And there'll be one single network of publicly owned banks. And there are all sorts of things that can come out of that. We can have a LIBOR-like equivalent as a benchmark to price consumer loans, et cetera, so we can get away from using private banks to generate benchmarks like that. But the fundamental possibility is that you have the people who have a role in shaping how the public credit is used in their respective economies. There's a tremendous value in North Dakota. They call it eating their own dog food. They keep loans on their books. If they make commercial loans, they don't sell them. If they make home mortgage loans, they don't securitize them. And so I want to point that out because the long-term view, and they do have this long-term view, which certainly hasn't shaped their decision with regards to fossil fuel development, but in other areas it has, and I think that's tremendously important. One of the reasons why they do take a long-term view is because the state of North Dakota is doing business as the Bank of North Dakota. All the assets and resources of the state belong to the bank. It's illegal. The Bank of North Dakota can put many of those resources on its balance sheet because of the statutes that were passed 93 years ago. Thank you.
As I understand it, I am all in favor. It sounds wonderful, public banks, but the revenues are begotten from taxes and fees. How did you escape the word socialism?
How did I? What do you mean? How did?
Banking, the procedure, the production, because that does sound like socialism, which in this case.
Well, okay, so actually there's another view, and that is that when you look at public utilities, you have water as a utility, you have electricity as utility, transportation, postage, any sort of transmission of communications as a utility, and we regulate those industries.
Not my question.
Well, hold on, I'm getting to it. We regulate those industries because we realize those are part of the commons. I would argue that credit is more a part of the commons than water or electricity because money is so important to the economic transactions within our communities. The production of money, which is what credit is. Credit, 97% of the money supply comes from credit. So when you look at these utilities, there's always a public service. You have water coming out of a tap in addition to bottled water. You have electricity coming over the wires in addition to batteries. You always have a public service. We do not have a public service of credit in this country. In North Dakota, they do. Whether you call it socialism or not, doesn't really matter because it's just viewed as a utility. Same with the flour mill in North Dakota. They view that as absolutely essential to the economy in North Dakota because of the large production of grain. And because of that, they don't want to have a private monopoly, control that very important function. Same thing with banking.
North Dakota seems more self-enlightened than most of them.
Yeah.
There were many times in America where the word socialism did not carry the negative implications. And at the time that the North Dakotans did what they did, many parts of the United States had socialist everything. Called it that, didn't have to shrink away from that. You might be surprised to know that there was one state in the Union that had more elected socialists in the state legislature than any other. I often ask American audiences to guess what state that was, because when I give you the answer, you'll understand how America has changed. The state in question was Oklahoma. You know, it's very important to understand. Socialism wasn't a bad term then. It was a very celebrated term. And you didn't lose your project because it was called socialist. You gained adherents. Later, in various efforts which did happen in North Dakota too, to destroy the bank or to shrink the bank, then the label socialism, when that was effective as a negative, was used. And the interesting thing is that by that time, that bank had settled itself into the minds of those farmers in North Dakota that even though they were very anti-socialist, they somehow needed to split themselves in half, which they did, because they wanted that bank and the benefits that you've talked about. So it shows you that under certain circumstances, you can get called a socialist, and it doesn't make any difference.
There's a conversation I had with Vice President at Large George Miranda. I said, as you well know, we Teamsters go across the country. As you well know, long trucking for the post office has been outsourced. Mr. Freilla, can you give us any tips on how to start?
You can go to our website, greenworker.coop, and sign up, register for our co-op academy, and we'll work with any team you got to launch a co-op. I know of one effort that was taking place in the port of LA that was actually along similar lines of creating a cooperative of Teamsters, of truck drivers in the area at the port, to create a co-op for the area. So certainly it's doable. It doesn't have to be with retirees. It can happen at any point, at any time. I was just having a conversation a little earlier before the program started with two gentlemen who wanted to start a cooperative of taxi drivers. So whoever they are, whatever sector, you can create a cooperative.
That's why Oklahoma does not allow third parties. It's the only state that doesn't allow it. It's impossible. My question, the mayor of Richmond, California, Gail McLaughlin, was a Green. You didn't mention that. It wasn't mentioned in the Times article. And they buy up the eminent domain. They use eminent domain to buy up mortgages of people who are underwater. Why were you so hostile to Ms. Alexis to you mentioned the city council, but you were very hostile to what they're doing there. So I'm just curious.
I'm not hostile to the effort at all. I'm hostile to the organization that brought it to the city council and to the mayor. I think it's a great effort, but Mortgage Resolution Partners is not, they're a Wall Street firm. They are doing this because it is profitable. They are not doing this in the best interest, and so it is nothing against the mayor. It is nothing against the initiative. I think it's a wonderful initiative. I just wish there was a different underwriter. I'm just not a fan of MRP. But because I think it is such a good initiative, and sometimes it's nice for, a Wall Street firm to go against a Wall Street firm, I think it's wonderful. So I'm actually not hostile against it at all. I'm just skeptical of MRP's motives, but I'm still very much in favor of it.
Thank you.
I'm going to read so that I can say more than, look at your faces and ask questions. My statements are, if you want to get, money coming into the United States, you should go work in another country where there's work, and send money home. Just like how all of us came to the United States and we sent money home and we made my state of Kerala rich. So that's one way. Then when you work for a business, you should really work as if you're responsible just like the owner is. Because I started a business in the Bronx in July, and it's hard for me to find someone who can speak and write English or add without a calculator. So there has to be better education. And part of the reason why there isn't good education all over America is because education is linked to property taxes. I think that's a crime, because if you live in a place that is poor, you're never going to get educated like the people in the richer areas. And my last statement is, we should stop fighting wars for other countries. I think the USA must learn not to stick its nose in others' business, and not even in Angela Merkel's phone calls. We should just stop. The question is, there are so many ways for this country to do better. It's just that the senators and the congressmen, when they get voted out, they just go to K Street and create more trouble. So how can you stop them from doing that?
Solve the American political economy in 2 minutes.
I'll take a run at this. So I think one of the biggest issues, and it's been an undercurrent here, is that the way we define wealth is always in terms of money. And I would just like to state that the only product that banks have is debt. And it's in their interest. Unfortunately, Scott Baker is not here right now. No, he's not back there. But Scott Scott came out with this statement, that's great. The only product they have is debt, and it's in their interest to have us think that money is both scarce and valuable. And the more we think that, the more we're going to migrate to other countries in order to earn a buck, the more we will exploit resources in order to monetize it, the more we take on behaviors that are really detrimental to our nest, to our world. And if we look at wealth as being our productive capacity, our ability to produce the goods and service that are needed by our brothers and sisters, if that's wealth, then you look at the new and local economy, which is true production of local agriculture, sustainable energy, things like that, which is produced locally, then that's the world we need to create. And we can do that with, of course, with public banking, but it takes this major shift in our understanding as to what wealth is.
And I'll just add to that, I think the answer is that we have to change our democracy. I mean, we have what is called a representative democracy, and based on the answer to Omar's question about how many of you felt you've experienced democracy in the last 7 days, a lot of you don't think that representative democracy is working for you, right? And I think representative democracy is very vulnerable to moneyed interest, to bribery, etc. So we could, if you look at technology and Twitter and Facebook, it's democratizing the way we communicate with each other. Why is our political landscape not also migrating towards that way? So that could look like something like fusion voting. It could be, in other words, like instead of having a representative vote for us, more things come directly to us and we as a populace vote on that. And there are pluses and minuses to that. That's just one idea, but that would be my other stab at that very good and difficult question.
Just to tie this to an earlier question about the possibility of disconnecting income from work. Next month, there will be a plebiscite in the little country of Switzerland. And the plebiscite is about whether the Swiss will pass a law giving every adult in Switzerland $32,000 a year, whether they work or not. So the idea that it can't be done and that these are impossible ideas just reflects the ideological fog in which this country exists, and the notion that the peculiar, dysfunctional, ineffective capitalism we have is the only way to run a society and the best thing since sliced bread, decades after that stopped being even remotely true. The problem, I hate to sound like an old socialist, but you could do worse. The problem is capitalism, and either we face it as a nation and finally grow up enough to debate it, or we keep deciding everything else we can talk about so we don't have to deal with this immense elephant in the middle of the room.
I think the next step is to promulgate these ideas, to educate to as large an audience as we can. I created an organization in the business world called the Ethical Business Society, and I put this out on Meetup as a way to get people in the corporate culture, who a lot of them are not familiar with these ideas. It's a small group, there's only 30 members, but little by little, every once in a while I go home and I check my email and somebody found us online and they join. And we have monthly meetings in a cafe in the village, and it's really to educate, and it's to help grow something within the corporate sphere. And you've given me so much information and ideas that I could bring, to this group. So I thank you very much, for that. Question to Rick, two of the most hopeful events I think that happened this year. One, Rick Wolff was on the Charlie Rose show, and number two, Rick Wolff was on Bill Moyers. What's your analysis of this? I mean, PBS is part of the elites. They don't generally give a microphone to somebody like a Noam Chomsky or a Rick Wolff. Is this a sign of hope that there is, people up there who do see, the truth of this? What's your analysis? What was the reaction that people had to this? Did anybody stop you on the street that they saw you? Or, and going forward, do you think it's dreaming too much to think that we could get you on Rachel Maddow?
Go for it. I don't know where that mic went. There it is.
There's no question that a fundamental shift has happened in the United States. It's just my personal experience, so I'll tell you. I've done more public speaking and media work in the last 2 years than I did in the previous 40. My story hasn't changed that much. I'm not a fan of capitalism. That might have occurred to you. And I haven't been for a long time. So this isn't, I'd love to say I've done something wonderful to make people pay attention to me. It has nothing to do with me. I sing the same song, I make the same criticism, I mean, I develop them, but it's basically the same thing. So the only explanation is a sea change in perceptions, in interests of the audience, the reactions of the audience, even the distance from Charlie Rose, which was over a year ago, almost a year, more than a year ago, and Bill Moyers, which was in February and March of this year. Already that was different. The reaction on the Charlie Rose, where I was with a guy named David Harvey, that some of you know, teaches in CUNY. So there were two of us. It was a shorter interview, and he is, I'm trying to say this politely, not so sympathetic, okay? Bill Moyers, who was much longer, I was on the program twice, was much more sympathetic, and the reaction there was overwhelming to him, overwhelming to me. So things are moving very, very quickly, and I am negotiating with other programs like that, but they require you not to talk about it until it happens. So for me, this is exciting. I don't deny it for a minute. I'm having the time of my life. I never expected in my life that these kinds of ideas that I try to pretend would have an audience that clamors to hear them, as opposed to people looking frightened as if they went into the wrong room. So, yes, I do think that there's an enormous change. It doesn't get a lot of attention, but if my life is any example, and friends of mine that have this, Chris Hedges, if you talk to him, because his name came up, would tell you exactly the same thing about what's happened to him and so on.
All right. Next question.
Okay, the question is for Mr. Freilla. In the Co-op Academy in the Bronx, what were the sources of startup funds for your cooperatives?
Great, thanks for asking that. So, thank you for asking that. So I had mentioned this a little earlier. Earlier this year, we partnered with a great organization called The Working World. The Working World, for those of you who may not be familiar with them, they have been, for the past few years, they cut their teeth in Argentina, providing loans to worker cooperatives, members of factories that had been taken over by their workers that had gone defunct after the Argentinian economy collapsed in 2001. And so they had started out providing loans there to worker cooperatives, then expanded to Nicaragua, and they just recently opened up shop here in New York City. So we created a loan fund with them called the Cooperative Green Seed Fund, so that any team coming out of our Co-op Academy has access to loans to be able to get their cooperative off the ground. And they used an interesting model of what they call non-extractive finance, where instead of requiring that the loan be paid back 1 month after it's granted, they actually don't take payment until the actual cooperative becomes profitable, which is a sea change, very different from how most banks operate, or how banks operate. So, it's, for the most part, they're called the Working World. And so beyond that, it's just whatever options that are available to people who are starting up a business like any other. And we certainly go into figuring out how to bootstrap and, working with a little bit what's available. But the ability to secure financing, secure funding for any cooperative is, it's a make or break. It's a make or break thing for any startup and for a cooperative venture. And it's a major reason why the Mondragon cooperatives that were mentioned earlier were really able to get off the ground. When they had begun in the 1950s, but it wasn't until they created their own financing through the Caja Laboral, a cooperative bank, that they were able to create financing for their cooperatives that allowed them to really take off and become the enterprise that they're known as today.
This is about the so-called Affordable Care Act, which I believe is not affordable or about care of the people. It's really about money-making options for different companies. So people are going to have to choose between making their monthly payments for their rent and food, etc., and then childcare or whatever, and then paying for these premiums. So I wanted to know if you knew any existing healthcare cooperatives, or will there be a way to start them? Oh, Oh, thank you.
While the speakers are getting their act together, I'll just
You
mention
might have
that,
stumped us.
my takeaway from every report I've ever read about the Affordable Care Act is that it is an absolute shame and should be a stain on all our consciences that we don't have a socialized healthcare system in the United States of America.
I'm not well read enough on the Affordable Care Act to really be able to give a statement on it, but I can say the answer to the question that you asked about are there healthcare cooperatives and do they exist? There are. Their growth has been stymied, really squashed by the insurance industry. So and I don't know to what extent the Affordable Care Act and its creation of what they call co-ops, which aren't actually healthcare cooperatives, but it's a sort of a membership alternative structure that exists. But there are healthcare cooperatives that do exist. There's one that covers New York State, but they're highly restricted in terms of who they can accept, much in the same way that credit unions have been restricted by the federal government and really by the banking industry in terms of who they can accept as members. So that's a very vague answer to your question, but there are healthcare cooperatives that do exist.
The United States spends somewhere between 17 and 18% of our GDP for healthcare. No other country comes close. The second country after that spends half as much. So we have a fundamental problem with the amount of money we spend for healthcare. When you measure the effect of our healthcare, the number of children that die in the first year of life, the longevity of people, the number of days in a hospital, we're mediocre. We come in the middle. We're not the worst. We're far from the best. Okay, in any other universe, if you're spending twice as much as everybody else and getting a mediocre result, something's wrong. This Affordable Care Act doesn't deal with the fact we have 4 industries that have us by the throat. The doctors, the hospitals, the drug and appliance makers, and the insurers. They've worked out a deal. Sometimes they fight amongst themselves, but they know that the game is to squeeze the maximum out of the rest of us. This Affordable Care Act does not fundamentally address that, and so you're left with one or another disaster on your hands, and whether this or that group can escape by this little mechanism or other, the basic situation has not been addressed.
I've been without health care since 2002, because right now I'm not working in a hospital setting due to back injuries. So I'm working in home care for an agency that's making, X, Y, and Z amount of money on my work, and I feel like an indentured servant, actually, and I'm going to have to decide between getting health care now and paying my rent. Like, it's, that's pretty sad.
Yes. Raise your hand if you're not insured. You got comrades in the room.
Hi there, this one's for Omar. I've been reading with interest about the experiences in Ohio with some of the cooperatives there, and one of the things I noted was that they were structuring themselves around what they call anchor institutions, like public schools and public hospitals, and so on and so forth, and I was wondering if anything like that is going on in New York.
Yes, there are, and what was being referred to is in the city of Cleveland, there is a consortium that has developed to launch cooperatives and seed cooperatives with the support of what have been termed anchor institutions. So these are large nonprofits, hospitals, universities that have extremely large budgets, and that as institutions that have large budgets that that are unlikely to be leaving the community at any point in time, they're seen as anchor institutions that are able to really move the economy with their purchasing power. And so there's been an effort there that it's been called the Evergreen Cooperatives, similar that model themselves after the Mondragon cooperatives, and the intent to really create a network of worker-owned businesses with these anchor institutions as their clients, as the businesses that are contracting them to provide services. So that is something that has drawn a great deal of attention since Evergreen launched a few years ago. And they have created a solar installation business. They've created a greenhouse. So they've created a few different cooperatives. The model of anchor institutions as being able to, cooperatives being able to divert the what's being spent from the existing institutions to cooperatives still has yet to be proven. But certainly it's great, it's generated a lot of interest. Here in New York City, it's also generated interest. In the Bronx, we've been part of an effort to do something similar in the Bronx with local anchor institutions through we've called the Bronx Cooperative Development Initiative, in partnership with other community-based organizations targeting Montefiore Hospital, the Bronx Zoo, the Botanical Gardens, Fordham University, and some other large institutions, trying to see where we can go with that. On a much smaller level, but still actually much more immediate, is this past, beginning in September, we actually started a cooperative class at a local high school called Bronx Campus High School. And in negotiations with the school approached us and was very excited about it. They've been bitten by the cooperative bug, and they said, we want to be an incubator for student-run cooperatives. So they contracted us to come in and teach a cooperative class to students with the intention that by May, we're going to launch a student-run apparel design and manufacturing cooperative. So the school is already committed to purchasing their T-shirts and clothing for the STEP team and the different teams from the co-op. So, and let me tell you, it's a lot of work to start a co-op with 15-year-olds. I'm a father of two. I have a toddler and a 2.5-year-old and a 6-month-old. But dealing with 15-year-olds, trying to get to consensus. We had a long drawn-out session just today. We had classes on Wednesday mornings about consensus, and one of the kids was like, said at one point, threw his hands up in the air and said, it's a lot easier to do. Let's just do majority vote. And this is how I want it to go. Who's with me? Okay, let's do this. Say, well, you're facilitating the meeting here. No, we're supposed to be going for consensus. And say, well, no, let's switch to majority vote. Well, you had to get consensus on whether you want to do majority vote. So it takes some work, but certainly even in just the past few weeks, it's been great and a lot of fun and getting to that level of transformation and seeing that happen in these kids. But really, that's a place where it has to happen. A question was raised earlier about education and how can we get to places like that. But we have to introduce these concepts about cooperatives and provide people with the opportunity to actually create them and work at it and make it happen at every stage of where we are. Certainly in the schools, but really in every possible venue where we are.
Some of the things that we talk about here are like the things we asked Alexis to talk about were things individuals could do, individuals who care about this problem already. And the Bank of North Dakota helps assert the community's interest. And the worker co-ops, you really talked about how it's going to be more advantageous to a community that the company isn't going to pollute where it is and that workers will care about that. But how does the community, which also is impacted by that sort of thing, assert its interest? What are the levers for the community to say, in that instance of the co-op, for example, to assert its interest in being for the worker cooperative as opposed to the capitalist industry that's going to put a lot of crap in the air?
There's an enormous range of things that people can do, and the best way to describe a couple of them is to tell you what people have done who've wanted to have co-ops as part of their lives. And I like to do this by reminding you that Americans claim that they're really interested in freedom of choice. Right now, if you want a job, you have a job in a capitalist enterprise. End of story. If there were co-ops, you'd have freedom of choice. You could go work in a capitalist, top-down, hierarchical enterprise, or you could work in we don't have that choice. We would have to create it. So I'll give you one example. Progressive people got together in Italy in the 1980s, and they forced through a law, 1985, the Marc law. And that law does the following. If anyone becomes unemployed in Italy, they have two choices, not one. They can choose to go on the dole for a couple of years, like we have here. That's the only choice here. You either go on unemployment or you don't. In Italy, you can make a second choice, not to go on the dole. You can get your entire 2.5 years of weekly payments up front as a lump on 2 conditions. 1, you must get at least 9 other workers, unemployed like you, to make the same decision. And you must use the pooled money as the startup capital of a cooperative enterprise. One of the reasons Italy has so many co-ops is they made the law to provide the money and the incentive. So instead of a person sitting every week getting their check and getting depressed about life, they're now wrapped up with others in an ongoing enterprise that they're committed to. Okay, that's one example. Second example, we have in the United States a small business administration. It's been on the books for decades. The idea is small businesses don't have a chance against big ones unless they're given certain advantages, which the Small Business Administration gives them. We do something comparable for minority businesses and so on. Why the hell don't we have a cooperative business association doing for Americans cheaper credit, technical assistance, 100 other things? You know, if communities saw the value of this, there would be an enormous thing. Last point, trade unions. Just imagine with me for a minute a trade union that came to an employer confronting them with, you must give me concessions, you must take cutbacks in your wages or cutbacks in your benefits, or whatever they usually do, or else we'll leave. The union then makes the best deal it can. But suppose the union said, hasta la vista, baby. You leave, have a nice day. The workers are staying, and we're going to run this factory. And we're going to go to the local politicians and tell them, you better help us. Otherwise, your name will be mud here because we're keeping the jobs here. We're keeping the money here. You either for it or against it. Very dangerous for you. And then imagine you tell the employer who's threatening you, go ahead to China. We'll run around the United States telling people they have a choice. They can buy what you produce in China with low-paid workers, or they can support us here. And whoa. And you know where the best example is of where that would work? In the 2 hospitals in Brooklyn that are threatening to close and deprive all those people. Imagine a cooperative hospital to save that institution, then making deals with all the co-ops that already exist. One of the reasons that strange fellow became our next mayor was he was on those streets in Brooklyn with those hospital workers. He didn't have a concrete plan of how to save it, but co-ops would have given him that.
I'm getting the stop sign. Thank you all for coming out. Be very good to each other. So long.